Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series for 2018. The speakers today are Sandy Stockwell and Ellie Woodacre from the University of Winchester in the UK, and they'll be talking about shades of meaning and exploration of student and tutor perceptions of nuance in written and audio feedback. So Sandy or Ellie, whoever you'd like to begin, please.
Thank you very much. You've got Sandy first. I'm assuming everyone can hear me, and you tell me if you couldn't. And hello all, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Matthew for inviting us to present today as well. We're looking forward to sharing our research with you. This is the first time that Ellie and I have attempted a webinar, so I'm hoping everything goes smoothly, but please forgive us if we have an odd glitch, hopefully not. So yes, I'm Sandy Stockwell. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Teaching Development at the University of Winchester and training primary school teachers. I'm presenting jointly with my colleague, Dr. Ellie Woodacre, and she's also a senior lecturer in Winchester, and she teaches early modern European history, and we've split it roughly halfway between us, so you'll hear from Ellie later in the session. We do have another two collaborators in our research, and that is Jane Jones, who's a senior lecturer also in primary education at Winchester, and also Nick Purkis, and Nick is a senior nurse lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. So our research runs across different departments, different faculties and two universities, and we think that's a particular strength of what we're trying to do. And so today we're going to share our research project with you. It is small scale, but it's been long term. We've been working together now over a few years on this. It's evolved into 4 different phases, and we're going to take you through the journey that we've been on and share our emerging findings with you. So our first phase was exploring student preference. Do they prefer written or audio feedback? Our second phase was focusing on our interpretations of the content of our feedback, so what we were saying. And then our third phase focuses on what the students interpret our feedback to be, and are they similar or are they different? And this final phase that we're in at the moment, phase 4, we're now starting to explore, well, how are we giving our messages, and is that having an impact on students' interpretation and understanding? We're very happy to answer any questions that are raised during the session. Ellie will be answering while I'm speaking, and then we'll swap over. But we've also built in a couple of opportunities where you can specifically ask questions, and we'll respond in the moment to those. Okay, so we thought we'd start by explaining our rationale to you, what brought us together and what drove our interest in audio feedback. Firstly, we all have a shared interest in using technology to improve feedback to our students. Ellie had been using audio feedback far earlier than the rest of us, and Jane and I attended what we call a learning lunch at the university, and we heard Ellie speak, and we were really inspired by what she shared with us, which started our interest. And Nick is completing an Ed.D. into the use of audio feedback, and I was already using blogging as an assessment tool, and students had responded very positively to that, so I wanted to look at other ways of using technology to engage students with their assessment. Secondly, obviously a massive driver was that we all had a desire to improve the quality of feedback to our students. Anecdotally, we were all sharing stories about how hard we found it when we overheard students collecting their assignments and then sharing their feedback with each other. I was often very disappointed by what I heard students saying. They were often expressing frustration over markers' comments or disappointment, even anger in some cases. And when you think how much time we as tutors spend in giving marking, I was wanting students to realise that, I was making informed choices about what I said. I didn't want them to think that we didn't care about the impact of our comments. Also, I didn't want them to be misunderstanding or misinterpreting the feedback that I was giving. I've actually found myself speaking to students and sort of defending my own comments or the comments of colleagues. And that's frustrating and it's upsetting when we all know that we're trying to do our best in giving feedback. I also know that it's my intention to sort of give feedback in a balanced and informative way so that the students know both what they've done well and also what they need to do next time. But for some reason, that's getting lost in translation. And in addition to that, there are numerous reports about student dissatisfaction in feedback on assignments. It's not just peculiar to me or to our university. And we were driven by our National Student Survey results, which again, year on year, were saying that students were dissatisfied with assessment feedback. We did some research, we did some reading around the subject. There were some key players. There was Rotherham, Merrion Osmond, and as I say, various student experience reports that got us thinking about, okay, what can we be doing to meet students' preferred type of feedback? And the University of Winchester is one of 4 involved in a national teaching fellowship project, which is called TESTA, and that stands for Transforming the Experience of Students Through Assessment. And one of its findings is that many students did say they preferred audio feedback because they perceived it as being more developmental. They also said they wanted more feed-forward comments and they wanted increased personalisation of feedback. So those were all things that we hoped using audio feedback would achieve. And another point which drove us was that in an ideal world, if we all had endless time available, it would be great to meet with each of our students, to give them an individual tutorial, to talk their assignment through. Of course, that isn't possible. So we were hoping that using audio feedback would be the next best thing. It would be a way of providing what felt like one-to-one, personal, friendly feedback. And then revisiting this point of we all spend a lot of time marking and giving feedback, we wanted to make sure that the time we spent on it was time that best served the needs of the students. And again, we were hoping that audio feedback might improve that. And finally, because Jane and I are training primary school teachers who are obviously going to be engaging in giving feedback to their pupils, we also wanted to model giving effective feedback and for the students to sort of recognise the impact of that when they're working with their pupils. So, we are now going to use the little voting tool, if that's all right. If you are already using audio feedback, would you mind just voting yes? And then we know sort of where our audience is coming from. Just watching the figures. So actually at the moment we're on a fairly even split, so that's fine, in which case I'll just give a brief explanation of how we're doing it, if that's all right. We're using something called Jing, which comes from TechSmith. The next slide has their web address, but they're not difficult to find online. And what happens is, as a marker, you log in and the student's essay is available to you on the screen. You can add written comments just as you would if you were marking online, for example, and you can make written comments in little bubbles down the side and then also summative at the end. But alongside those, you can add audio feedback. And what I love about it is it's live as such. You can point things out with the cursor, you can load documents for the students to look at, you can scan up and down the screen. All of that is then sent as a screencast to the student and they access that via a URL. So the student can actually see the feedback that you've written and they can also hear the feedback at the same time. So that's the system we're using. So as I say, the web address is there if you're interested in exploring it later. And in fact, TechSmith offer different options for giving audio feedback, but this is the one we were using for this project. So just to sort of run through our timeline for phase 1, we had a focus group of students. They submitted their assignments electronically. We then marked them using Jing, and we had assignments that were giving both formative and summative feedback to the students. We all kept notes of our experiences so we could compare those afterwards. The students accessed their feedback, and then we had 8 students who were interviewed by a student fellow, and that was through semi-structured interviews. The student fellow transcribed those, and then we moved moved on to analysing the results. So if I can just share some of the headlines with you for this first phase. First of all, we were really pleased that all of the tutors involved gave a very positive response to using audio feedback. We all felt it had enhanced our feedback, and predominantly because it made it feel far more personalised. We all felt it was as if we were in a conversation. We were actually talking to the students. So we perceived that we were giving improved feed forward, and that was because of an increased depth of response. We were able to explore our points in far more depth than when we were writing in the margins. So as I've already said, you could bring documents up onto the screen, you could write at more length, but also, obviously it's about the audio, we were able to speak at more length. And that ties in entirely with the research that you can see at the bottom of the slide there, which had informed our initial choices about what to do. So our findings are in line with what other colleagues have also said. And we also felt that we improved the balance between giving positive feedback and constructive criticism. So we were able to focus in far more depth on the positives than perhaps we would in written feedback. So whereas before we might just give a tick at a particular point or write good in the margin, we were now able, through audio, to explain what was good and why we were recognising it, as well as offering fuller suggestions for improvement. So we felt we weren't being limited by how much you can squeeze into a margin. And again, that all mirrored the research of others. So interestingly, we had a very positive response from the students, again in line with research which is already out there. You'll see comments such as, it's much more personal, it's much more meaningful, you could hear your good points and your bad points. And we were really pleased that students were saying they would revisit it, they would listen to it again. And when we interviewed the students later on in the process, they were able to confirm that. Yes, I went back, I revisited it, and I listened to it before I wrote my next assignment. So there was a real sense that the students felt that tutors were more engaged with the marking of their assignment because of the fact that they were able to hear what we were saying. So another big finding for us, which is what's then had an influence on our current phase of research, is that tone of voice became really important. Being able to use our tone of voice to support the meaning we were trying to give emerged as a strong theme for both us and the students. So we've already recognised that students don't always receive written feedback as we've intended it, and sometimes I get the feeling that they are hearing our voice as though we're being negative or punitive, and that's a really big important thing that we wanted to overcome. So what happened, because we were using audio feedback, all of us found when we compared what we said, we all set the context at the beginning of the audio file, so it was far more personalised. So, good morning Kirsty, Sandy here, I'm going to be giving you some feedback on your assignment. That was also mirrored at the end of our feedback, so we gave a very positive summary and wished them well. We were very conscious when we analysed what we were saying that we used the student's name a lot, and again we might not be doing that when we're writing in the margins, but frequently it would be, Kirsty, I really like how you've done such and such, for example, and obviously that makes the feedback far more personal, but it also softens it, because again it's as though they're actually speaking to you. So we hoped, in line with what other researchers said, that would sort of, it would mean that the research was being received more positively and leading to an increased sense of well-being for the students. We were all very positive about being able to use tone of voice in order to carry meaning when we were explaining our feedback to students. We felt it made our constructive comments about what they could do better sound less critical and sound more supportive instead. So for us as tutors, we find using audio feedback far more rewarding. an important point about that was that we felt it changed the power dynamics. So it was as though we were sat in a tutorial with the student. It felt far more friendly. However, there were some tutor concerns. Because this was new to several of us, we were worried about, how do we sound? And one colleague in particular was very concerned, do I sound very young? Is my voice too high? Is my voice too low? And we overcame those things as we grew more confident with it. We also started to make sure that we varied our tone of voice to try and support student inference. And we became very conscious of the language that we were using. I think all of us were making choices. Do I want to sound very professional, or do I want to sound informal? And we were sort of thinking, how would we be talking to the students if they were sat in the room with us? I think we were also conscious about whether we had any verbal tics. So, saying a lot, for example. So it took a bit of practice for us to feel confident in doing it. I think also because you're speaking off the cuff, which we'll come on to in a moment, sometimes you're aware that you might have used clumsy expression. But the feedback we got from the students was, well, actually that makes it human, and they actually liked that. So that was very positive and reassured us. So in terms of the student response to our tone of voice, again, this was really positive. All of them said, yes, it makes my feedback feel more personal. And if you can bear with me, I'm just going to read some student quotes. And we've got more personal, definitely more personal. It's about what I wrote. Well, it felt more personal because she was saying my name. It feels like I'm having a one-to-one. It's like you're talking to him, isn't it? It feels like I'm talking to him. You're basically having a personal tutorial. They were a lot clearer being spoken than perhaps they would have been if it was written down. Written feedback feels a bit vague. It feels like it's not aimed at you. But here, her tone of voice is encouraging. It encouraged me. I know my lecturer was saying how well I did in the essay, and that was a big encouragement, because you don't get that through written feedback. It was quite nice to listen to someone explain their points more. So like having a meeting. Obviously, written and spoken language is so different. When it's written, it can sometimes be a bit like, I don't know, like when you're talking and you can expand a bit more, and you've kind of got the tone and everything, and it just makes it more sense. Sometimes written feedback sounds more harsh, but this is like having a conversation. It's nice. Sorry, I'm nearly there. I just think these are interesting. This one in particular struck us. Audio is easier to understand. It's interpretation. Someone could put something and think, that's rude and that's not useful. But with audio feedback, they explain it. So I hope that that's sort of indicating the positive response that we were having from our students. So it became very apparent to us that when we communicate verbally, we're doing it in a very different way than when you're writing feedback. And so for students, written feedback isn't always straightforward to understand, but the tone of voice of their marker in audio feedback does make a difference. And they were saying, it's as though I can imagine you in the room. I'm with someone friendly who's sharing comments with me. And I think that says a lot about our relationships with our students. Interestingly, though, research indicates that while students prefer audio feedback, it doesn't necessarily have any impact on student outcomes, which is something that all of us want to pursue. So we've been having a discussion around, do students like it because it's friendly, because it's soft? But for that very reason, is the feedback not being taken as seriously as perhaps it should be, because they're sort of seeing it as, or it's advice rather than something we actually need to go and do. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we move more into our subsequent phases. So I think the last theme that arose from our first phase was about issues of time. Yes, doing audio feedback took longer to complete than providing written feedback, but it felt a lot more productive in terms of our use of time, which is again in line with the research of others, in particular Rodway Dyer. We used Jing, which had a 5-minute audio limit, and that stimulated very different lecturer responses from us. More comments were needed for weaker assignments, so 5 minutes often wasn't long enough. So one tutor produced 2 audio files, one following another. Sorry, excuse me. Another tutor created one file for strengths and then another for giving summative feedback. And I actually didn't do any rehearsal. I just literally audio recorded as I went along. Other tutors were rehearsing first and then recording, and obviously that meant it took longer. Also, you had to keep a track of time when you were giving feedback to make sure you covered it all within the 5 minutes. And it didn't suit everything. As I say, I was already using blogs as an assignment for some students, and giving audio feedback on blog entries was really time consuming because of their frequency. But again, we found that practice improved things there. So from the student perspective, their response to issues of time, again they said it took longer to listen to the audio files, but as you see here on the slide, they said actually that's good because I'm engaging far more with it. I'm not just skim reading. Now the comment from student G there, with comments you could just skim read, write a little comment and skim read. Initially, I understood that to be that that's what they were doing. They were just skim reading written comments. But actually, when we explored it further, they were saying that when they read tutor comments, it could just be that we've skim read their assignment, that it could just be that we've just made a comment at sort of bits as we've come to it, whereas their perception was with audio, you've really read my assignment, you've really engaged with it. And lots of the students were saying, yes, wouldn't it be great if every lecturer did this? But again, they were acknowledging that that could take a lot of time. So there were technological challenges when we first started using audio feedback, and we all had concerns about the quality of the recording. A lot of us were doing our marking at home, so you'd have a truck go past the window, or your cat would meow, or the postman would knock at the door, and again we were concerned, would we have to delete the comment, would students be offended by that? Again, students actually said they liked it, it made it feel far more human. And Jing wasn't appropriate for all the assignments that we tried it with. As I've already said, trying to use it with online blogs was very difficult. Blogs themselves, it was hard to give meaningful oral feedback. It became repetitive from one post to another. But we all found Jing easy to use. We all picked it up really quickly, and we were sharing tips with each other. And we loved that you can exemplify different points. We loved that you could give a very positive summary at the end. We could pull the files up onto the screen. We could ask student questions directly. So it felt as though it was producing far more meaningful feedback. Interestingly, we've recently started at the university using something called Canvas, and we're giving feedback electronically via Canvas. But because of that, we're having to reevaluate how we use audio feedback. You can no longer give audio against each comment as simply as you can with Jing. So we're sort of in a place of transition, and we're having to rethink different things at the moment, which will prove interesting. The students had some technological challenges, and particularly if they were using iPads or iPhones, they'd often say they had to use a desk computer in order to access the files, and issues around the volume, but again, yes, we can use headphones. And then other students, it was really easy to use. So sort of just sum up that phase one, overall, all of the students reported increased satisfaction through receiving audio feedback rather than written. They were all saying it carried more nuance. They had increased sense of us being involved in reading their work and giving them feedback. And again, this tied in with the research that's already out there. The interesting thing is, is it going to make a difference to their coursework? Interestingly, one student, as you'll see on the slide, said, well, maybe you could make it audio and live so we can see them talking, which we thought was rather sort of humorous, You're sort of wondering about by the time you've done written feedback plus audio feedback, and now let's have live video feedback as well. But maybe that's something else to consider. So just before we move into phase two, I can see that people have been posing questions, and those have been answered. But are there any sort of live questions that anybody wants to ask either Ellie or myself about phase one? I think what I'll do then, I'll move straight into phase 2 and we can keep taking the questions as we go. So phase 2. The end of phase 1, we were really confident that both us as tutors and our students preferred the use of audio feedback. So now we want to explore, what is it about audio feedback that makes a difference? Is it just because students can hear it rather than see it? And we were reminded of that old adage, it's not what you say but the way that you say it, which made us think actually that there's 2 aspects to giving meaning. One is the content, that what it is you're saying, and the other is how you're saying it. So our second phase of research went into what are we saying. We wanted to analyse the content of that. And we thought we would start at text level and then we would move down into sentence and word level, as these 3 different layers of analysis. So there is lots of research already out there about students preferring audio feedback, but there is far less that we've come across that analyses how we're giving it and how that might impact on student understanding. So again, we chose a sample of transcripts, both audio and written. Again, we had a student research assistant who helped us to transcribe the feedback that had been given. And we were informed by the work of 2 particular studies, one by Kavanagh and Song and another by Chalmers et al. And we'll unpick that a bit more as we go along. Kavanagh and Song compared the type of comments that were given in written and audio feedback, and they found that written feedback, surprisingly I thought, was more specific, and also there was far more focus on academic writing such as grammar, punctuation, whereas audio feedback was broader, more generic. And then Chalmers et al., they were exploring what different types of comments were given, and we decided to use the categories that they generated. So this is the table that we produced in order to analyse our feedback. You'll see across the top that these are the categories that Chalmers et al. Identified. So first of all, we've got a category of identification of errors, and this is where, as a marker, you point something out to a student, but you don't offer any explanation, you don't offer any way of moving on. So it might just be, I'm not sure why you've done such and such, and you leave it for the student to respond to that. The next category, correcting errors and explaining misunderstandings and misconceptions. Here you might point out an error. I notice that you've quoted such and such, but you then tell them what to do next. What you need to do is, and so you're explaining misunderstandings. If you see this in the future, you need to do X. The reason it's Y is because. So you're offering something to the student so they know what to do next time. And our third category of analysis was about giving praise and demonstrating good practice. So giving praise was comments very general, such as okay or good, well done, but it was also specific comments, so I liked your use of such and such, and demonstration of good practice. That's where you were really pointing out to a student what they had done well and how they needed to do it again. So I like that you introduced X and then went on to, you've now, you've demonstrated your understanding of whatever. And the next category was suggestions for future study. And this is where you might be saying to students, it would be useful for you to go and read this text, or next time please try and avoid. So it was very much sort of letting students know explicitly what we wanted them to do in their next assignment. Justifying marks, the penultimate category, was about letting students know why they might have lost marks, but also what they need to do in order to get a higher grade next time. So this would have been in the first class category had you done such and such. The final category that you can see here, other, we generated that ourselves. That isn't in the Chalmers et al. Research, but and Ellie will discuss this in more depth in just a second. But they were a lot of comments that we found ourselves making which didn't fit into any of the other categories. You'll see 3 categories down the left-hand side of the grid that you're looking at. These relate to our marking grid at the university. So in broad terms, we give students feedback against these three aspects of their assignment. So firstly, subject knowledge. Have they understood the content of what they've written about? And is their interpretation appropriate? The second one down is academic practice, and that is all about, have they chosen appropriate literature to read? Have they read sufficiently widely? Have they synthesized the literature alongside practice? And so it's very much about quantity versus quality. And then our final category of giving students feedback is about standard things like grammar, punctuation, referencing, spelling, and so on. And so actually that's me done. I'm going to pass over to Ellie now. We'll start to unpick our findings in relation to this analysis. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Sandy. I hope everyone can hear me. So I'm going to carry on from here and just talk about the number of comments. So one of the things that I wanted to clarify off the bat is what we mean by a comment. So obviously we're not talking about just word count, because obviously in terms of word count we know we use more words in audio than written feedback. It's about a comment itself. So one comment might be, say in a written comment might be, you know, correct spelling or something. In an audio comment might be, you know, again, here I can see, you know, Susan, that you're really having an issue with spelling this particular word. So, for example, this would both be a comment. So just tallying up the kind of aggregate total here, you can see that actually there's not that much disparity between the minimum and maximum amounts of comments that we were making in terms of written and audio. And actually we were surprised that the maximum was slightly higher in written feedback, but the average is fairly similar. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the breakdown. Now just moving forward, I've got some graphs. Now Jane, one of our project members, is, as Sandy mentioned before, a math focused, and she loves a good graph. So we've got a few. So hopefully that will help kind of clarify some of the things that we're looking at. So this is a comparison of comment types. So going back to that grid that Sandy just showed you, this is again tallying those comments across those main categories. So as you can see here, one of the things that we found really interesting is where the kind of bulk of the comments lie. So as you can see here, we have a real emphasis on correcting errors and explaining misunderstandings, which is not, you know, that surprising really. We were pleased to see that we were, you know, giving praise, that we weren't just correcting errors or pointing out, you know, issues with spelling or problematic areas for their work. We were a little disappointed to see that we weren't making as many suggestions for future work as we might have thought that we were doing, actually. So that was one thing that we wanted, that it made us more aware of, that we needed to do more feed forward, that was one of the intentions or the real kind of possibilities for audio feedback, as Sandy talked about earlier. And then there was this other category which Sandy mentioned, and that other category was something that we found really surprising. As Sandy mentioned, we had to create a whole kind of area in our grid for this, and we found that that other category was something that we were starting to suspect is what made audio feedback feel more personal. So for example, one of our project members, Nick Perkis, had a real tendency to make comments. So for example, he was commenting on the students' discussion of the Holocaust and particular, you know, kind of atrocities that were being committed, and he actually made a comment that said, yuck, you know, he was kind of expressing his emotion about this is really terrible to read about. Or he would always thank his students, for example. He would say, you know, thank you, Maria, for turning in this fantastic essay. So these were things, again, that we had to kind of put in this other box, these kind of spontaneous discussions, comments that just didn't fit into these other types, but that students seemed to find to be a real kind of personal aspect of the work. So just moving forward here to the comment focus, again, that other area of the grid, we saw that there was a fairly good balance between the different types of comment focus. So again, you know, there was you know, an emphasis on academic practice, but also interestingly more commentary on subject knowledge in the written feedback than the audio, and that written standard English was actually fairly similar. And again, that other category, much higher in audio feedback than the written. So again, we just wanted to take a little moment here for more questions and comments. I see that there's been some real activity in the chat box, which I'm sure that Sandy will be responding to as well. Antonio, that's really fantastic that you're working on a research project in this area, and we'd love to hear more from you as you're developing your work. Hopefully that's something we could compare our findings with. And also Rachel, thank you for sharing this particular article. We'll look into that as well. So that's absolutely fantastic. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to take a moment to answer them. If not, I'm sure Sandy will be jumping in on the chat bar. Okay, I'm just going to carry on forward. And what I'm going to talk about next is, oh, yeah, thank you, Antonio. Sorry, I just saw your question. Yes, we are looking to publish more of our work. We've been at the kind of dissemination phase of our project, hence the webinar here, but we are intending to publish some of our work soon, and we'll keep you posted on that. So thank you for asking. So moving into the next phase, phase 3 of the project, what we were trying to do is link together two halves of the tail. One is kind of identifying student preferences in relation to the wording of the feedback, and then comparing that. So what we really wanted to do was really get a greater understanding of students' perception of feedback, and also what tutors thought they were doing. So again, comparing what tutor intention was. This is what I meant when I wrote that comment. This is what I meant when I was recording that screencast, and what students were getting out of it, and what they wanted as well. So what we did in order to achieve that was we kind of had a split screen scenario. So on one side of the work, on the student perception, we actually brought on a PhD student as a research assistant, and what she did is ran a series of focus groups with students. Now these, interestingly, in our first phase, we were working with students who had actually received the feedback. In this phase, because it was a couple of years later, we were bringing in students who it was not feedback to them. They were looking at and reading scripts that there were the original kind of where there was original written feedback. They were also listening to audio screencasts, and then they were also reading a transcript of audio feedback, because one of the things that we were really keen to find out is how much of it is auditory, how much of it is listening again to tone, and if students could still pick that up when they read a transcript of audio feedback. So she was working with these focus groups, and again, they were reading the written feedback, listening to the audio feedback, and then reading those transcripts. They used exactly the same grids as we did. So we had sat down and coded all of those comments previously against that grid. The students did exactly the same thing with the same grids. And then at the end of each session, the research assistants did semi-structured interviews with them, which were recorded and preserved, which was really brought out some really interesting bits and pieces in the discussion. And one of the things we really noticed straight away when we started to look at the data was there was some really interesting variations between, again, tutor intention and student perception. And again, more of Jane's fabulous graph. So this is a really good example of that. If you see here, this is script 9, and on the left-hand side, you can see how we had coded the comments in that particular script. So you can see the breakdown again that we had between identifying errors, correcting errors, etc. Now, if you look at the 4 students, there's a couple of things that I'm sure will really jump out at you. One is there's a huge difference between tutor intention, where you can see the highest bar is clearly correcting errors and explaining misunderstandings. That's what we thought we were doing. But the students who were reading and listening to that script were getting something completely different out of that. So again, you can see, particularly with students B and C, they thought the emphasis was on suggestions for future study, that it was more feed forward rather than correcting. So again, between the students themselves, you can also see there's a lot of disparity in terms of their perception. So this is something we started to look at and go, wow, okay, we weren't expecting that. So this is something that, again, is leading into the next phase of the work. It's something that's highlighted this interesting disparity, again, between tutor intention and student perception, but also the fact that different students will react to the same exact feedback in very different ways and perceive it in very different ways. So just moving on a little further forward into the comment focus, there is, again, a really interesting disparity between the tutor intention and the student intention, perception, and the different students. So again, as you can see here, the tutor felt like there was very little subject knowledge focused in this particular script. But if you look at all of the students, particularly student B was almost kind of off the charts in terms of what they thought was going on there. So again, massive disparity between tutor intention and student perception, and again, massive divergence between the different students in terms of what they were taking away from that, from those comments. So this leads us on to kind of a bit of a summary on kind of what we're starting to see. And again, I want to kind of emphasize that we're still going through, we've got so much data from that phase, we are still literally crunching all the numbers and really kind of thinking through these findings. But this is what we're kind of taking out of it at this stage. First of all, as I mentioned, that students do not appear to interpret comments in the same way as their peers. And that's something that's really important for us to kind of consider. Is one of the reasons why we were getting into audio feedback, as Sandy rightly mentioned, is that we were trying to personalize it. But it's almost another level that's required because it's very personal to different students how they perceive that feedback. And obviously they're interpreting comments in different ways. Even when it's heard, even when there's tone of voice, they're still interpreting that in different ways. So, you know, again, the breaking down the number of comments, again, that were giving praise and demonstrating good practice, that seemed to be a little bit less divergence there. So again, praise is probably easier to identify. But again, that real disparity between what we thought was correction and what they thought was feed forward was something that we really wanted to kind of focus on. Again, you know, everyone basically noted there was less commentary that was justifying marks. And again, from maybe a QA perspective, as I think Peter was touching on earlier, you know, perhaps we need to do more justifying of marks. I know that's something that my program leader is very keen that we do more of, you know, kind of linking it to our marking criteria, and again, making sure that students are crystal on, you know, why we've marked their work in a certain way. Again, the correcting errors and the further study issue, as I've just mentioned, that's where that real disparity is. And that students really seem to think that more things are about subject knowledge than we did. So one of the things that was kind of interesting, and again, we're still unpicking this data, but it appears that students' interpretation of these comments seems to be a little more in line with what we were intending when comments were heard rather than read. And again, we're still unpicking that data, but if that holds water, that's really quite interesting, because again, that would really feed into what we're talking about with using tone of voice in order to increase students' understanding of what we're trying to get across with them. So one of the things that we wanted to kind of prepare as we kind of get to the end of our session is a takeaway. The takeaway, what you can kind of you know, use out of this research that we've been doing to kind of enhance the reception of feedback, perhaps with your own students. So one of the things that we really found from the student discussions and comments is that they really didn't like one-word responses, things like good, because that's really ambiguous. You know, again, we tended to use ticks or good, especially in written work, and again, students weren't sure what good, how is good, you know, what is good, so that's something that they really weren't keen on. Posing questions, students realized that it was challenging, but they actually appreciated that we were trying to get them to think deeper on the topic. So, you know, when we kind of threw things back at them, what did you mean by this? Have you thought about this, etc. Students really, you know, they engaged with that. They wanted really specific guidance, and again, that plays to the little cartoon that we've got here. They didn't want general statements like, you know, you've done well here. They wanted to know exactly what they'd done well. They wanted, when we were giving them, you know, comments on things they needed to fix, they wanted really specific guidance on what exactly they needed to do better. Okay was something that was really controversial. They did not like, again, okay and good. Those were the things they found most frustrating. And okay, they felt like okay could be negative as much as positive, and that was something we needed to be aware of. Again, ticks were often used in written comments in particular, and they appreciated that ticks meant something was good, but again, they just couldn't tell what it was that was good. And then finally, making sure that you're specific about whether or not you are correcting errors or making suggestions for future work. And I appreciate that sometimes you're doing both, but it is really important that you are making it clear what you're doing there, because as we noted on those previous slides, often when we thought we were correcting, they were seeing that as what they could do better for next time. So this final phase, just to kind of finish off the session here, where we're currently at now is really breaking down what we are saying at text level, at sentence level, and at word level, to really try and understand exactly what we're doing, what we're saying, and how that impacts students' perception of our comments. And this is an area that is really near and dear to Sandy's heart, given that her focus is on English. So we're really breaking it down in terms of sentence and word level analysis. So what we're trying to do at a sentence level is really, again, looking at the syntax, looking at the types of comments we're making in terms of, is it a question, is it an explanation, is it constructive criticism, and then down to word level, again, classifying the vocabulary and thinking particularly about tone, intonation, and modal verbs. Now, this is one of the things that we think is really interesting. Again, we're going from the, what do we say when we're giving feedback, and now into how do we say it. And some of the initial findings that we're kind of excited about is that we think one of the real disparities between students perceiving what we were saying as suggestions rather than corrections has to do with the kind of verbs that we were using. So one of the things we noticed when we were listening to the audio feedback in particular is we tended to use soft commands. So we would say, you might want to do this, or you could have done this. Now what we meant is, you should have done this, this is incorrect. But what we found is perhaps, again, this is perhaps British politeness. Instead of saying, Susan, this is wrong. You really, this is incorrect. We were saying, well, Susan, you could phrase this a little more strongly, or, Susan, you might want to consider, avoiding, contractions or something like that. So again, we were being very polite. We were using soft commands, and I think students found that more friendly, and again, it reduced that power dynamic. But what it was also doing was getting students to misunderstand that we were actually making corrections. We were saying, this is not right. And what they were perceiving is, oh, these are things I can do differently next time, or I might want to, think about in the future to enhance my work. So that's something that we're really getting into right now, and we're very excited about this phase of the research, like I said, Sandy in particular. So again, we've been looking at this same set of scripts really intensely in so many different ways, but again, we're just trying to break it down and go deeper and deeper into the material that we're using in order to really enhance our understanding of written and audio feedback, and hopefully use that to improve assessment full stop. I just wanted to round up with some questions. Again, thank you guys so much for coming today. I can see there's been some fantastic stuff in the chat box. So I can see that Sandy's been responding to that, which is fantastic. But if there's any last questions, please do type them in, and Sandy and I will jump in and answer those. Oh, thank you very much, Jeff. Any last questions? Oh, yes. When do we expect results from Phase 4? Well, thank you for that, Karsten. We are in the middle of Phase 4 now, so we're hoping to complete our analysis at the kind of Phase 4 level by the end of next academic year. So we're really hoping to have, again, probably, hopefully by the kind of this time next year, to have something to say about the data coming out of Phase 4. Sandy, anything you want to jump in with?
Just to say this has been really interesting, and I'm really enjoying the comments that people are posting. Thank you.
Oh, Matt, thank you. You said responding to feedback is part of a feedback loop. That's a really good point. That's something that our university doesn't necessarily do, and I think actually it would be really, really useful. Again, particularly with this kind of experimental, side of things. When we were first trying this out with audio feedback, it was really new. The only time that we've had some response to this has been as part of the research project. So as Sandy mentioned, in phase 1, we were getting students to give us feedback on our feedback. I also ran a project kind of separate to this with some student fellows, where again they were giving us feedback on whether they liked written or audio feedback, and that was an interesting process to get their feedback on our feedback. So that in that case we have, but not in a general sense. So that's a really interesting point. And Tilly, a Kazina, that's really interesting. I haven't used that personally, but I'm going to go have a look at that. So thank you for giving us a shout out on that. That's fantastic. And Tristan, just finally, I think you said, have you any thoughts about how audio feedback will work when second marking and moderating? That's something that Peter kind of mentioned as well. Now, again, it's not, it is something that we have had an issue with in the past. We have had issues with external examiners in particular, and this is, going back a few years, that we're really keen on everything being on paper and everything being very traditional. Now we've kind of moved to electronic submission and increasingly to e-marking, and our external examiners have to sign an agreement now that they are willing to, use digital files and potentially audio media. So that's a possibility. I did have a colleague moderating my module at one point when I was doing a bit of a pilot on audio feedback, and again, this is a couple of years ago, and my particular colleague had no issues with listening to the screencast. So that was absolutely fine, but certainly it's something that you need to consider. I think it's something that you need to consider as maybe on a departmental level or on the institutional level if you start to incorporate more audio feedback, just making sure that colleagues are au fait with kind of how it works and also willing to listen to those screencasts if they're doing moderation. Thanks, Tilly, and thanks to all of you who have come along today. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to listen. And finally, as Sandy's kind of just moved it forward, some of you asked about references. Here's a list of references, some of the ones that we mentioned. It's obviously not all the papers that we've looked at in terms of doing our own research, but hopefully in terms of some of the ones we've specifically highlighted as we've gone along today, that gives you some connections there. And if you're interested in further literature on the topic, again, Nick Perkis, one of our collaborators, is doing his Ed.D. in this area, and I'm sure he'd be really happy to talk to you more about that. So thank you again for this fantastic session, and again, thank you to Matthew for inviting us to participate.
Thank you very much, everyone.
You're all most welcome. Yep, the references are up, and the next point, of course, is we would kindly ask people to please fill out our feedback survey before people go. That would be great, because we would like to share your feedback on the session with our feedback presenters. So we're really into feedback at the moment. So, oops, somebody pressed the wrong button. Okay. Alrighty. So there's our last slide. So thank you very much. If people actually would like, we've still got a couple, still got 6 minutes to go before the hour is up. So if you'd like to have any more questions, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to put up your virtual hand using the hand symbol if you'd like to ask a question via your microphone. Otherwise, you are welcome to type it into the text chat like normal. So if there's any more questions, just have a spin down the list to see if there's any. Are you typing? Elaine might be typing. I can see somebody. I know a few people are leaving. Let's just see if everybody else.
All right, okay.
Questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions there. Accessibility issues. No, Blaise, we haven't yet come across any accessibility issues. That's a really interesting comment. Obviously, there are issues with students who have visual or hearing impairments, and obviously we would have to consider that. I know we have had a student in our own department who has severe visual impairment. I think for him, audio feedback would be a great benefit for that reason. But that's a really interesting point, and obviously we would have to take that into consideration. documentation. So we have, our students have documented learning agreements, and I think if we had students that had particular issues in that regard, we would definitely want to take that into account. But we haven't yet found that to be an issue. And Elaine, you've asked about international students, and again, I think someone else brought that up earlier. Certainly we've not, I don't know if Sandy's kind of found this yet, but we haven't yet found that to be an issue. In our particular departments, we do have some international students, but we haven't yet found that that's been an issue with them in terms of understanding our language, cultural differences, etc. But I do appreciate it's something that we need to think about. And I have read a study, which unfortunately is not on these slides, so I can try and dig it up and send it along, that someone's been looking at that particular aspect with a group of international students, because of course, you know, that can add a layer of difficulty. I think I also mentioned in the chat box earlier, it's something you need to think about with pace as well. I know as being a Native American, I'm sure you can tell by my accent, I do tend to speak quite quickly. I need to watch that. But one of the joys of audio feedback is you can back it up and listen to it again. I also have colleagues who are, you know, English is not their first language, and they've said to me that they're not sure about using audio feedback because they're worried that students may struggle to understand them due to their, you know, again, accent. But, you know, again, I think it's a fairly forgiving medium, but you're right, there is always that issue in both written and audio feedback that, you know, adding language, different languages and different cultural framework can muddy the waters in terms of understanding feedback. In terms of Turnitin, I think someone mentioned earlier about using Turnitin, which again, we do have it. We tend to use Canvas's marking tool, and it has its own inbuilt tool. But that is something that's quite interesting. And I'd be curious to hear more from other people who are using audio on that as well. So thank you for that question, Maureen, and hopefully we can get some feedback on that. And Peter, yes, yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, this is really, really helpful for people who are doing distance learning. I have a colleague who runs a distance learning MA, so again, this is something that, you know, I can talk to her about and get her feedback on if she feels it's been valuable with her students, because you're absolutely right. It adds that layer of personality when you might have a disconnect because you're not regularly meeting with students. So yes, absolutely agree with you that that's a really useful use of audio feedback.
I like what Yvonne has said about it hides spelling errors as well. You're quite right. You just need to make sure that you speak clearly.
Good point. Any last questions? Again, thank you all for being so supportive and for your great comments and ideas that you shared in the chat box. It's been really fabulous. It's one of the really nice aspects of a webinar session that you can't normally do that in a presenting in a conference paper style.
Yes, I'm really looking forward at picking up some of the points and applying it back into our research now. It's going to help us to develop what we're doing, so thank you.
Yeah,
all this stuff will be recorded, so the recording's published, and the text box, the text chat will be published as well. I'll stick that on our website in the next couple of days. So all these resources and anybody's links that they've been sharing, etc., will be up there as well.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Okay, so I think we're probably done because most people I don't see any more text chat. If people are interested, the next session is on something called Risk Aware, which is related to students' clinical competence in risky environments. So if there's anybody from the health sciences kind of area or anybody who has students going into risky environments, you might like to get onto our webinar next month. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. I'm going to shut off the recording, but please don't feel you need to evacuate immediately. So thank you, Sandy and Ellie.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
You're welcome.